Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome. I'm Carly Mercier from the New Zealand Drug Foundation. I'm Policy and Advocacy Manager. If you don't know us, we're a charitable trust. We're based in Wellington. We're independent of the government. One of our many roles is to facilitate community discussion on topics relating to drug law. So there's a referendum to legalise adult cannabis use this year in September as part of the election. And this webinar is part of a series that we're doing about the legislation that backs up that that piece of that referendum. So at the referendum, you'll be asked about yes or no to a bill, which is called the Cannabis Legalisation and Control Bill. And that bill sets out a model for legalising adult recreational use of cannabis. So the bill's not about medicinal cannabis. We've already got a piece of legislation about that, but this conversation is about how those two bits of legislation really match up together. So welcome to everyone. I can see people beaming in from all over the country, which is really lovely. I'm going to introduce our illustrious panel in a second. I hope you can see them. I'm not actually sure exactly what you can see, but I can see them and they're looking lovely. So I just wanted to do a first few housekeeping things. So this is not like a Zoom meeting, it's a webinar, so we can't see you and we can't hear you, but you can hopefully hear and see us very well. Have a little play with your screen, but down the bottom there's a chat function and a Q&A button. So if you click on chat, you can talk to other people who are listening in and to us. If you want to ask us a question, you click on Q&A and you can put your question in there. And we'll do our very best to get to everyone. I'm not sure if we'll be able to get to all questions, but we'll do our best. We've also got New Zealand Drug Foundation team sitting behind the scenes, Natalie, who's moderating on the chat, and Stephen and Tom, who are doing tech stuff. So welcome to them too. So we have a wonderful panel with us today. Rebecca, who is sitting right beneath me, but I don't know where she is. So give us a wave, Rebecca. So she is a patient advocate from way back. She's been making waves, becoming the first New Zealander to win the right to individually import a medicinal cannabis product, though I believe that didn't last long. And she's even made herself, as she put it herself, government enemy #1 at one point, trying to fight for her right to medicinal cannabis access. But she then had the last laugh last year when she got invited to sit on the government Medicinal Cannabis Advisory Group. So hi, Rebecca.
Good morning.
So then we've also got Manu, Caddie. So Manu was also on the Medicinal Cannabis Advisory Group last year for his business expertise. But he's also a staunch patient advocate and community development advocate as well. So Manu's president of the Medical Cannabis Council, and he's also co-founder of Rua Bioscience, which is part of the Hikarangi group on the East Coast. I'm sure many of you will have heard of the story of how they crowdfunded a medical cannabis growing company a few years ago. So welcome, Manu.
Kia ora. Kia ora koutou.
We also have Pearl Schomburg with us, and she is another formidable patient advocate in Wahine toa. You may have seen her on TV or various online forums, maybe submitting to Parliament on medical cannabis issues. She's convener of the Auckland Patients Group. She's not only a source of great information and guidance and counsel to patients, but also I understand she has a big following now of GPs and neurologists and other specialists who ring her up for her advice and to download her knowledge on medicinal cannabis. Hi, Pearl.
Marina, Caddie, and thank you very much for this invitation.
Great to have you. And last but certainly not least is Shane LeBrun. He'll need no introduction to many of you. He's also an amazing patient advocate and has been for a number of years since his wife became ill and needed access to medicine that she couldn't get legally. So Shane is the founder and coordinator of Medical Cannabis Awareness New Zealand, an organisation that produces loads of good resources, that lobbies the government, that submits, that goes and talks to media on behalf of patients around the country. So Shane has also been a great help to me in my role at the New Zealand Drug Foundation. Encyclopedic knowledge of everything relating to cannabis. So welcome, Shane.
Good morning, everyone. Pleasure to speak to you today.
Cool. So just to sort of give a bit of context, New Zealand Drug Foundation, we're very aware that this is a really important issue for a lot of people. You know, it's a life and death issue for some people, and for other people, it's an issue that is the difference between living a life well lived or poorly lived. So it's a really important, and it's a topic that's very dear to my heart. I've been working on this since I started at the Drug Foundation a few years ago. We've been involved in helping patients make submissions on the various bits of legislation that have come through on medicinal cannabis, travelled around the country, hearing patient stories and stories from green fairies, and you know, some of them are very heartrending. There's a lot of people out there who, you know, tell how scary and stressful it is to be trying to access medicine and having to be afraid of the law while they're doing that. And you know, we don't think that's right. So someone did ask me, why are we hosting a session on medicinal cannabis, or from a patient perspective, on this Cannabis Control Bill, which is actually, you know, about legalizing adult use of cannabis and not strictly about medicine at all. And to that, I would answer that the medicinal cannabis regime came into play in April this year. Along with Manu and Rebecca, I sat on the Medicinal Cannabis Advisory Group last year. And I think we had great hopes that it would really open the door for patients to, you know, easier, faster, quicker, and cheaper access. And I think it's true to say it's a slow burn. I don't think we have certainly not got that yet. We may over time, but I think we're coming more and more to the conclusion at the Drug Foundation, at least, that we need this cannabis referendum in order to get great access for patients. We're sort of almost looking towards it as the saviour for patients, because it's just not going to be, the medicinal cannabis, you know, regime is not yet giving them that access, and may not for quite some time. So that's why we've wanted to do this talk today. So let's crack in. To make sure we cover all the key points, I think there's certain things that a lot of patients will be wanting to hear about. I'm going to start with asking the panelists a few key questions, and we'll do that for the first sort of half of the session, and then I'll start asking the specific questions that patients have been asking. So remember, you can ask questions through the Q&A, and you can also chat to people through the chat, which I see you're already doing. Great. So I wanted to start with a question for you, Rebecca. The Cannabis Control and Legalisation Bill sets out a really quite comprehensive regime, and it was set up for adult recreational use rather than for medicinal cannabis patients. So it says, for example, that you can grow cannabis for sale, but only if you have a license. You can sell it with a license in standalone stores only. You can buy it if you're 20 or older, and you can buy a maximum of 14 grams. There's going to be very strict rules around labeling and around content and around potency controls, and there'll also be a levy on sales, which will be spent on drug harm treatment and reduction. So the whole bill is really set up to reduce the harm that cannabis can cause for people who use it. And that's been the focus, rather than, you know, for patients, and they obviously have quite different needs and interests. So I'm just wondering, from your perspective, with patients in mind specifically, what do you think of the bill? Is it going to help them get people better access, cheaper access? Will it fill any gaps left by the medicinal cannabis regime that's not working super well at the moment? What are your thoughts on that?
Thanks, Callie. I have lots of thoughts on that. So I made a list. Great. And I'm going to try and get through them quickly. So first of all, yeah, I totally agree with you. Patients need this referendum to pass. And I think that's a message we need to get out in public as well, that the medicinal regime is not going to serve all of our needs. We don't know what products are going to cost under the medicinal regime, but we do know that there's going to be no home growing, which a lot of us were hoping for. And it's going to be this prescription system where you have to go to your doctor and get a specific product rather than access to experiment with the different products out there. So it's much more traditional pharmacy model, and the products could be expensive because they're at quite a high pharmaceutical standard. So, right. So that's why we need the referendum. So what do I think about the referendum? It's quite conservative in terms of what's allowed, but we have to keep in mind the government has written it in order to give it a good chance of passing with most New Zealanders. So I'm going to say it's not perfect, but it's going to be a huge improvement. So here are the reasons for me. So like you said, anyone's going to be allowed to grow 2 cannabis plants, or 4 per household. Don't think that's enough. We'll get into that later, but it's a lot better than zero. And some other cool things that I think are specifically relevant to medicinal users. One provision that I really like is the government has actually put this term in the law called social sharing, which is that any one of us could gift up to 14 grams of cannabis, that's half an ounce, to anyone else of the legal age. And there doesn't seem to be specifications around, correct me if I'm wrong, but whether that's gift can be once a year or once a week, or it's just that you can gift 14 grams of cannabis. So that opens the door for people to help each other out, you know, along the lines of like the green fairies, compassionate suppliers that we have. Another really good thing is, unlike the medicinal regime, which is really like high fees to enter for companies, and so it's all these really big companies, there's more of an effort towards economic justice with the model in the referendum. So there's going to be a cap on how much legal cannabis can be grown, and it's going to be allocated to different companies. No one company can have too much of the cap. And they're also setting aside a part of it for what they're calling like micro licenses. So specifically for small growers. So again, that's where maybe some of our current underground suppliers will be able to get into the legal market because licenses will be set aside for them. At the start, there will be dried cannabis, raw cannabis, and seeds and plants available to be produced and sold, which is great. So we'll be able to get our seeds and to get basic cannabis from the start once things are up and running. But they've left the door open to edibles and oil tinctures and all those things, and which I think will be frustrating for some patients because a lot of us don't want to use the herb. A lot of people like to take it as an oil or an edible, but that's something that can happen down the track. And again, it might be just that that's a compromise by the government to get it to pass at first, with all the kind of hoo-ha around like, they're going to sell cannabis gummy bears. So cannabis gummy bears aren't going to be allowed, probably ever, but definitely not at the start. But you know, if home manufacture will be allowed of medicines, and those can be given to each other as long as we're not using like dangerous solvents. So there's nothing to stop anyone from getting some cannabis, making it into cannabis oil at home and using it themselves or gifting it to someone else. That's all going to be legal. Yeah, another thing that I like is there will be stores that can sell cannabis, but there can also be consumption premises where people can use cannabis. I like that because, well, it can be a social thing. And also there are things models overseas where there are like cannabis medicinal social clubs. So you could have a place where people can come to a non-threatening environment, especially like older people who don't have experience with how to use cannabis, talk, exchange products, learn from each other how to use it, share, that type of thing, which I think is really good for our community of medicinal users because people really like to share information. And the cost, yeah, that's really big for a lot of us who have health challenges that we don't have maybe a huge amount of money to spend on products. And it's hard to say at this point because we don't know what the taxes are going to be like. But there's a likelihood that it's not going to be that same sort of pharmaceutical standard, although that hasn't been set yet. So decent chance of products being affordable, but I don't think we can really make a pronouncement till we see what the taxes are going to be like.
Cool. Yep.
That's my nutshell.
Oh, that's a fabulous summary. Thank you. So I think I take out my summary of your summary is that it's there's quite a few issues for patients, but it's probably better than what we've got now. Pretty good. Anyone else from the panel keen to answer that question? No? Manu?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I did a couple of columns with medicinal cannabis legislation regulations in one and the referendum in the other, and I had the key factors that I had were price, quality, grow your own, and product range. And I had 3 crosses in the medicinal cannabis and 4 ticks in the referendum for those 4 areas. So yeah, and I think like Rebecca said, there's still quite a bit of uncertainty around things like price and what the quality standards will be, but the fact that there is grow your own and there will be a wider product range that should be more accessible all seems positive for patients from my perspective.
Cool. Yeah, okay. Yep, Shane?
Yeah, I was just going to drill down on the lack of choice on the prescription model. As Rebecca alluded to, there's a lot more scope for experimentation in an adult use model. So with cannabis being a controlled drug and prescribers being very reluctant, the minute you get a prescription or you finally convince your doctor to prescribe one cannabis product, say you don't like it, the THC is too strong, you're then going to have to go back and argue again, I want to try the different strength flower, you know, with more CBD or something. Whereas in an adult use model, you'd go into the dispensary, you'd have someone who knows what they're talking about for a start, and you know there'd be a whole lot of wares, maybe not on display or maybe in plain packaging, but they'll be able to coach you through the nuances of the different products and the pros and cons of each. The prescription model is not going to do that for quite some time yet, unless we've got some really enthusiastic doctors who are users themselves.
Right. And Pearl, what's your take, since we're talking about products, what's your take on how that's going to look? So Rebecca alluded to the fact that we would have, just to begin with, only sales of fresh and dried cannabis to begin with, and over time they will implement allow other products if they can show that they're safe, or if producers can show that they're safe, and that they won't appeal to young people. I'm just wondering and also you'll be able to bake your own brownies, for example, at home. But I'm just wondering, in terms of products, what you think this bill will allow, not allow, and how that works for patients from your perspective.
Thank you, Caddie. Well, like Rebecca said, this is a bill that's been written to appeal to all parties in the government to get it across the line. And as such, it's not perfect. It's not perfect for patients, and it's not perfect for patient supporters. I think the only way that we're going to be able to achieve a good document at the end of the day is you know, to create an amnesty over all patients and their supporters during this transition law reform period, so that all patients and their supporters, including fairies like my fairy Gandalf, can actually have a say you know, with security in the new legislation. At the moment, their voices aren't being heard. There's a lot of patients like myself who have no chance of growing and making their own products, which this bill is fantastic for allowing. You know, Auckland Patients Group, without a doubt, supports a yes vote at the referendum. We totally believe that this is a way that we can see patients being able to gain access without fear of prosecution to safe and consistent cannabis products. However, we also want a pathway, a good pathway, where we can perhaps continue to use the fairies that we have gained good health and quality of life with. And you know, at this stage, there is no pathway for them. And I'm hoping that we can address that during submissions. You know, once we get the yes vote at the referendum, we can polish up this bill and turn it into something that will cope, you know, particularly from my point of view, with patients' access. You know, with all this media at the moment, I did an interview recently with Russell Brown that was published in the Herald, and I appeal to elderly people with my story and my journey, and I get inundated with calls after those media pieces for desperate patients looking for product. And you know, this black market currently can be a very scary place for naive users, and you know, this bill offers a safer pathway, particularly for our elder folk who maybe are very naive about this plant. And yeah, I support it personally, and you know, every single patient that I know supports a yes vote as well. We see it as the only way forward. You know, other countries, UK and Australia, have chosen the same legal reform pathway that New Zealand has, and many years down the track, I think it's about 4 years now, their patients are generally still not able to access products through the legal system. In New Zealand, we have a great prescriber hesitancy towards patients. And in fact, often when patients raise the subject of requiring a prescription, they're viewed from that point on as a drug seeker. And in fact, some have their normal pain medication restricted due to their inquiring about cannabis products. It's just not good enough. You know, these are not people that are wanting to get high or stoned. These are people that are wanting relief from symptoms, and they're desperate, you know, and this makes them, you know, let's say easy prey for some unscrupulous people out there who are more concerned with making money than helping patients to gain wellness. This is a great concern for us.
Right, yes, great, strong words. Thank you, Pearl. Did anyone else have anything to add on the around the products? What sort of products will be available? Thoughts on that?
Can I just say one more thing about that, Carly?
Yeah.
In terms of, you know, I just want to say edibles, you know, let's just have a conversation about them in terms of elderly folk. I know many folk who, you know, all they have is a cookie at night with their last cup of tea before they go to bed. They have a great night's sleep. They use it no other way, just a cookie when they go to bed. And I don't know whether people realise, but, you know, having a good night's sleep is the beginning of good health. In terms of older people, you know, it gives them a great start to the day. I understand that edibles are not included at this stage. It's a bit sad, really, because, you know, they are useful products for some people and without danger. If they're in a regulated system, it'll be very easy for patients to access that.
Right. Yeah, thank you. Shane, did you have something to add there?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen in the bill they're talking about prohibiting new and novel dose forms to try and prevent, you know, the general public picking up more harmful ways to consume cannabis. But some of those dose forms are actually medicinal and are not likely to come out through the medical regime. I don't imagine that the New Zealand companies are clamoring to go and make suppositories, for example, from cannabis. And yet, I mean, I've got a recipe book here from Rose Renton, and she's literally printed out the recipe in a book on how to make suppositories, and people are using it successfully as a way to absorb it for cancer pains. And another trend that's come through is endometriosis is poorly served in New Zealand. So while it was kind of a wacky product form in the States when it first came out, people are actually finding medicinal benefit of using personal lubricants with THC for pelvic pains. So to have those things written out on the first bat saying, well, suppositories are for medicinal, the medicinal regime's not going to serve those users.
That's right.
Yep.
Yep.
Okay, and it's worth probably noting at this point that if the bill is voted yes at the referendum, it will go through a parliamentary process at that point, or it would normally do so. I presume it will in this case also. So it would go through a select committee process. So there will actually be chance to make submissions on all of these points. So, you know, make a note of these points that are relevant for you guys, everyone who's listening, and be ready to make submissions on the bill when it goes through Parliament if we get a yes vote, which we've got to do. So Shane, I wanted to talk to you a bit more about the plant limit. So you'll be allowed to grow 2 plants per person at home. You'll be allowed to grow 4 per household. If you contravene this, there'll be a fine to pay. It won't be a criminal fine, it will be an infringement fee. So that is good, but it will be difficult for some people to pay it. I think it's between $500 or $1,000. If you grow more than 9 plants, then it starts to get into the criminal penalty territory, including prison sentences. So I wanted to find out what patient advocates think about this proposed grow limit. It's obviously not designed with patients in mind. You know, what do you think the strengths and weaknesses are, or what the problem's going to be?
I mean, that part of it is it's a cannabis control bill, and it's trying to keep a lid on it. And one of the big things in the States is when they've had higher plant limits is everyone's growing excess to do some black market supply to make a bit of money on the side. And all of that is outside of the taxed market. So it makes sense for them to clamp down on the numbers. But then the joke going around in the patient community is 2 plants. I'll just grow them this size. And that's an issue too, because once people get over the legalization side, one of their main complaints is the neighbors don't like the smell of it. So what I think would be a more accurate way to do things is by a size. So when most people grow indoor in tents, there are specific size tents, and people in tents grow small plants, and the regime doesn't really account for that. So if you're growing in a small tent, you might have 4x4 plants in a sea of green, like this picture behind me, sort of thing, with a really high density, but lots of little plants. So I actually think ditching plant counts altogether and going to a specific size. And I mean, it's going to be a bit of a weird thought having the cops come out with a measuring tape for your outdoor plants. But considering most people will be growing in greenhouses or in indoor tents, I think that'd be a much easier way to regulate things. And it would allow the connoisseurs to have multiple varieties with multiple effects, growing at once. Because while most people think cannabis is cannabis, some people think the same of wine, and yet the connoisseur will have a rack with 50 different varieties of wine and think nothing of it. But yeah, cannabis is different between varieties, and people should be able to explore that without having a 2-plant limit, which basically means you'd take 10 years to get a decent whack of the different varieties on offer.
Yeah, interesting point.
That's
cool.
True. Can I make a point about that too? And you're right, this bill hasn't been structured taking into consideration patients' needs at all. And one thing that we see in our community is patients doing incredibly well on raw cannabis. Now, that's one reason why we need to have patients growing their own in their own homes. It's the only way they can go out and grab a handful of flowers and leaves and put it into a juicer and create a tonic that actually will reduce potentially their need for other cannabis products. So, that's a separate need and a separate, particularly strain of plant that's required. And then, patients that I know, including myself, use medicine in terms of strains. I use a sativa dominant hybrid in the daytime, and I use an indica strain in the evening. Thanks to my fairy Gandalf. And I use a variety of balms and products like that when I require them. So, 2 plants is not going to be enough for any of the patients that I know. It's quite ludicrous to think that patients could manage on 2 plants. And there's all that situation. I'm not a grower, so I'm just kind of alluding to things I hear about. You've got plants who are growing, before they can actually produce anything. I don't know what that 2 plants would mean. Does that mean they can't have any seeds germinating on their windowsill as well as 2 full-grown plants? I think these are things that we're going to have to nail down during the submission process. But, currently there is no allowance within that for patients who have serious conditions and possibly require a lot more raw product, to make their medicine as well.
Yep. Manu, did you have something to add there?
I agree. The number's too small, and also I think from a practical perspective, they would be good to differentiate between a flowering plant and a plant that's in the vegetative state or seedlings. So just picking up on Pearl's point there, from a practical perspective, it doesn't seem like they, as someone in the chat said, that people making the rules don't necessarily understand the plant or sort of the practicalities of some of these things. So, and also back to your point, Carly, I think there's, in some ways, a more conservative bill being put up now for the referendum's probably advantageous for those of us that want to see it go through, because it would be greater support for something like this. So the risk is that the incumbent government say, well, that's what people voted on. But as Pearl and others have said, I think there's those opportunities in the submission process to fine tune it and work it out. And so in some ways, I think, this isn't perfect, but it's a lot better than what we've got at the moment. And for those that say, oh, it's not perfect, so I'm not going to vote for it, I sort of struggle with that position.
Right. Well, I've got you, Manu. I wanted to ask you a bit about, from a business perspective. So the bill has obviously lots of regulations and rules. It's all about controlling cannabis. It's got things like, no giving cannabis to animals. As Shane mentioned before, no cannabis suppositories allowed. There's a lot of detail in there, and they've obviously thought long and hard about many different issues from lots of different angles to come up with it. But I'm just wondering, from your perspective, do you think the model will be workable, especially for small scale growers? Will it be overburdensome, and how would that compare with the medicinal cannabis regime from your perspective?
I mean, looking at what's in there at the moment compared to the medicinal cannabis regulations, it feels very permissive, and
Right.
I'd love to be able to work in that environment. So on the one hand, I think the devil will certainly be in the detail, as we've seen with the medicinal cannabis regulations. But the legislation is one thing, but the regulations is where the practicalities get worked out. And we've just come off another call with the technical standards group for the industry, and we're having battles with the ministry around quality testing, stability testing, all those sort of things, and actually having the facilities in New Zealand that can provide for the pharmaceutical end of things is proving to be a challenge. So I think it will be around what the rules are in terms of the quality standards. Is it going to be, assume it's probably going to be sort of a food grade standard, not a pharma, but there will be quality standards to ensure that people aren't getting pesticides and heavy metals in their product. That all adds cost. And I think the security costs are a big one as well, and that will be a big determinant for who can enter the market. And so we've been pushing the ministry hard around that and trying to, and they've been actually very forthcoming, I think, and flexible around the security arrangements so that smaller growers can participate more easily. And so we don't have to have motion detecting thermal cameras on every corner of the facility. We can have fences that are appropriate for the, for the quality of, or the levels of THC in the plants that have been grown. And I think we'll see that shift over time as well. There's a lot of stigma around the plants still at the moment through the medicinal growing. And then as, if the referendum passes, a lot of that stigma is going to move on, and people won't be so afraid of THC and things. And I think we'll see some of those security requirements reduce pretty quickly. So I think those are the key areas around particularly testing and security that will prevent smaller growers, if the requirements are too high, from entering the market, and particularly for those green fairies that have a lot of knowledge and expertise and been supplying patients. We do want to make sure that they're able to legally supply. That's the whole point of this. And so making the licensing regime much easier to access than medicinal has been will be really important. So overall, I think yes, and I like the way that they've structured the economics of it, trying to separate the growers from the retailers. I think that's a positive, so we don't end up with monopolies. The 20% limit on how much of the market share a license holder can have, those are good things compared to what we've seen overseas. And so trying to distribute the benefits and the opportunities as widely as possible, and ensuring that those that have been disproportionately penalised from prohibition have an opportunity to participate, feels like a great principle that this legislation seems to be based on. So that was really positive to see that the licenses will be given to those who can prove that Māori and other groups that have been penalised and stigmatised themselves through the prohibition period are actually going to be able to participate and receive benefit from those licensed providers. That all seems good from my perspective.
Excellent. Yeah, that was one thing that really jumped out to me as well, that they're really making an effort to try and get small scale growers on board, especially those that come from communities that have been particularly harmed by prohibition, by the cruel arm of prohibition. So that's a really great thing about the bill. You talked about cost there. I've had a couple of questions come through on cost in terms of how the cost is likely to compare to the black market, but also how it's likely to compare to the medicinal cannabis market as well. Who's keen to talk about that, Manu?
I'll just touch on that. I think we've seen overseas, and even in this bill, one of the concerns for me is that they want to fund not only the regime itself, but also a whole lot of health services from taxes and levies on the product. And I think there's a big risk there that we end up, as they have in California and other jurisdictions, loading heaps of taxes on that mean that it can't compete with the black market. It already is going to have quality standards around testing and security that the black market doesn't have to meet. And if there's more burden put on those that are trying to do it commercially, it's going to be very difficult to compete with the black market, and they're not going to achieve the goal of shifting it away from the illicit market. And likewise with the grow your own, I think if that can be expanded, it can reduce the temptation or the attraction of the illicit market. So yeah, cost is going to, certainly compared to pharmaceutical grade, I think production will be a lot cheaper, and we will see prices drop considerably on what you can access. Likewise in medicinal, at the moment they're saying you can't prescribe smokable product, and obviously under this people will be able to access dried flower, and they're saying that'll be prioritised, so that's a good thing, and we'll make those sort of products at least accessible. Yeah, and overseas I think we've seen a shift, and I think there'll be a challenge potentially. In Canada we've seen quite a lot of product move from medicinal to recreational after legalisation, and some of those really seriously sick patients who rely on the pharmaceutical grade consistency have struggled to access the same product after legalisation, because the companies have moved production where the bigger money is and the easier production and regulations. So we need to be careful about we don't create some perverse outcomes in that sense.
Right, really interesting. Has anyone else got anything they wanted to add on that?
Yeah, one of the things that concerns me is that, green fairies and individuals have been using this plant in its very simplest form as a remedy for centuries, with less than food grade quality, and nobody has died yet. With the current proposal, I don't see any pathway where my fairy could actually hold a license to do what he does now. It seems to me he can either grow or make or sell. I don't know any green fairy in my community that doesn't do all three. And I think this is one of the things that we're going to have to work on in the submission process, to create a pathway for these kinds of boutique growers, our very good ones, of course, to bring a product to market, to a legal pathway. This is something that's missing. And I want to also right now do a big shout out to all the fairies out there who have been supporting our patients up till now, with quality products, that our government hasn't been able to bring to us yet. Our fairies are stepping up all over New Zealand increasingly at the moment, to cope with the request for medicines from patients, and yet they're still criminalised for doing that. The patients that they serve and help are criminalised as well. A couple of years ago, the government actually placed a form of an amnesty on palliative patients for the last year of their life, but it wasn't extended to their fairies or the people that help them. What Auckland Patients Group would like to see happen right now, immediately, to enable a better conversation on law reform, is to place or to extend that amnesty that they placed on those palliative patients over all patients and their supporters during this transition period of law reform. And I believe what will happen then is that we'll have a better chance of bringing this market into a legal pathway. And if we don't, it will remain underground, and we won't have achieved what we absolutely set out to achieve in 2017. And that would be a great shame. Sorry to babble on.
All good points. Anyone else want to add anything there?
Yeah, I'll just add to that. So there's been a bit of a learning experience in Canada that we can watch, and that has been a bit of a train wreck. And there's competing needs for products. So for medical cannabis companies, they need massive economies of scale to actually get the cost down to an affordable situation for patients. But New Zealand's a very tiny country. So to get economies of scale, well, you'd be looking at 1 or 2 companies maximum. So they'll put this 20% cap in. But the lesson is that they allow micro licenses now in Canada, but it was too little too late. I think they allowed them in 2017. And the big companies all started up in sort of 2013, 2014. So by the time the micro licenses were allowed and people could apply, the big ones, Canopy, Afria, Aurora, they'd already taken, 70% market share. So it's very good that from day one, they're doing the opposite, and the micro licenses get special treatment and they get a reserved block of the market potential, and none of the big players can seize more than 20%. So what they're proposing is probably the most friendly to the little guy, to the green fairy, to the small business of any cannabis regime in the world.
Right. Cool. We've had quite a few questions, 3 or 4, I think, about CBD products coming through. So what do the panelists think? Will CBD be more available under this legal market? Will it be available without a prescription? What's your feelings on how that's going to change the CBD picture? Who's keen to answer
There's
that?
multiple pathways to achieve that. Because as an industry body, the New Zealand Medical Cannabis Council had been doing some exploratory work around getting it off prescription, at least in some doses. And in fact, in Australia, in the medicines regime, they are proposing to push it down to pharmacist only for doses up to 60 milligrams a day. But with the regime, CBD products don't seem to have any special treatment yet as a general sale product. They'll still be available from dispensaries, but so it'll be really up to the companies and public demand for those CBD products within the regime. But outside of the Cannabis Control Bill, it'll certainly be great to get low dose CBD products down to general sale medicine status. So it could be at your pharmacy or at your supermarket next to the paracetamol and that sort of thing.
Right, so likely to become more available, more easily available under legal cannabis, but also there's room to improve things under the medicinal model and make it more easily available there.
Yeah, there's multiple ways to attack it, and I think the Cannabis Control Bill is the best way to make CBD freely available for anyone over 20.
Anyone else want to add?
Yeah, another thing around that. So with CBD products, really important thing is how much THC is allowed in the CBD product. So even if we manage to get the medicinal regime version of CBD allowed in pharmacies over the counter, it would be a very, very minuscule amount of THC that's allowed in those products. So a little more THC actually for a lot of conditions helps the CBD to work better. So even if we get the perfect CBD into pharmacies, it won't be the best CBD. So if we can get CBD products under the referendum legislation with a little bit of THC in them and different ratios, and just walk into a shop and be able to choose from products with different CBD THC ratios, that would be a huge win, because a lot of us don't want just straight pure CBD. We need a bit of a blend.
Right, yeah, good point. And while we're talking about that sort of potency limits or potency amounts of CBD and THC, Rebecca, what the current legislation says that the potency will be set by a maximum potency level for THC will be set, and possibly there will also be some kind of level set for CBD, though that's not quite clear yet. And they've set an interim level of 15% THC for products, but in the end that'll be decided, when it becomes legal, it'll be decided based on what's currently available in New Zealand, and they haven't really done that research yet. So just wondering if you had any thoughts about, that 15% THC limit that they've set at the moment. I
do have some thoughts. I think I think that limit's pretty ridiculous. So for a few reasons. I know what the government's trying to do is they're saying, we don't want people to be stonked out on too much THC, so let's minimize the THC levels. So only 15% is allowed. So just for reference, like when I go back to California, where I was born, there are products selling with 20 to 25% THC in some of the buds that are for sale. I don't see how limiting it to 15% is really going to prevent anything. What does it mean? It means your buds aren't as strong, so therefore it's not as cost effective to buy them because you've got to smoke more for there to be an effect. So then that means that people are smoking a bigger joint and putting more smoke into their lungs. I understand the reason they're doing that, but on a practical level, I just think it's a little bit silly and is going to keep a lot of the primo genetics from overseas from being relevant here, because people are developing higher THC strains. I mean, I think if they want to limit how much THC is getting into people, then the way to do that is by limiting what sort of concentrates are available, but limiting the potency in buds, I don't think that's really going to help anyone too much.
Right, so it's like, from your perspective, the concentrates that are more important than the plant in that respect. Yeah. Pearl, were you going to add something?
Yeah, I would. You know, from a patient perspective, frequently patients who are at the end of life or who are in high pain, myself included, with chronic pain and post-surgery, I'm having another surgery next week, we require THC levels much higher than 15%. You know, adults who are used to cannabis products can moderate their use and their psychoactivity from those products. But personally, in the past, when I've been loaded up to the eyeballs with morphine and lots of other products from prescriptions, you know, that feeling of being wasted and the side effects of that was much worse than anything I've ever had from a high THC FICO product, fully extracted cannabis oil product, which I believe will be excluded under the current regulations. You know, we can sometimes create higher percentages with double infused balms. You know, these are things, patients will find a way of getting around that. But like Rebecca says, patients will just have to use more. And I don't know, you know, from a tax gathering point of view, maybe that's the point. But, you know, our concern is about the comfort of patients and, you know, their needs are the important thing. And until we have those discussions openly with patients who aren't afraid to talk about what they're doing, and fairies who support them, we're not going to really know what patients need from these regulations, and if we don't, the black market will continue.
Right. Cool. Yes, good point about the black market. So we've got a question here from Craig. He's wondering how long the time for the select committee process might be, how long before we could see legal products on dispensary shelves after the referendum. And I guess it would be quite interesting to know how that would compare to the medicinal cannabis regime as well, because that's taken 3 years. So who's got comments on that?
You know, given the government came in with a commitment to getting it done in 100 days, Shane will remind us about.
Yes, they did.
Anyway, so and they're very motivated.
Yeah, I wonder.
I don't think they're going to be as motivated on this one to pass it quick.
Pearl, what were you going to say there?
Sorry for interrupting. I wonder if perhaps that it will be fast-tracked more because the level of licensing and regulations won't be quite as much as a medicinal model. That's what I'm hopeful for, that, you know, that there will be products appearing quicker because that's what counts, you know. And in the meantime, fairies will still be stepping up, helping patients. You know, more patients out there will be using cannabis products. And the dangers for all will continue. Amnesty.
Yep. Anyone else got an estimate for how long they think it might be?
The experience from the medical cannabis bill, yeah, and as Manu said, pre-election they promised to legalise in 100 days, and then they downgraded that to introduce legislation in 100 days. But for the actual regulations to roll out, it took 888 days from the government being formed. And from there, the companies still have to go and get licenses and get GMP or pharmaceutical grade certification and then develop their products. So you're looking over 1,000 days in the medical regime. But for recreational, the experience from the States, Shane Retty went and explored what was happening over there. And if a government knew what they were doing and wrote out a really good set of regulations, especially when it's a food grade, you could have a 12-month turnaround potentially. But that's ignoring the actual submissions process and getting it through the final stages. So once the regulations are nailed down, it'll be potentially a year. But the question is, how committed is the government to getting to that level, getting it through first, second and third readings in Parliament and all of that?
Yeah, I'd agree with that because I mean, this bill is a lot further forward than medicinal cannabis was when the 3 years started. So we actually have a really comprehensive bill, but the regulations would still have to be drafted and the bill would have to still go through select committee process. So it would, I think, it'd definitely take a year at the minimum. We also had a, sorry, Rebecca.
Yeah, sorry. One thing worth noting is also it will take some time for the products, but as soon as the bill is passed into law, we should be able to get our plants growing right then. So the home grow will start as soon as it's legal.
It's a great point, and the fear about being, convicted for having products on you will also hopefully immediately go when when it becomes legal.
I just want to point out the home grow has started and continues.
Yeah, it's already going on, folks. We do realise that. I had a question here about stigma from Gary. Does the panel think that the Cannabis Control Bill will reduce the deeply ingrained stigma that patients currently struggle against?
No, I don't think it will. I think, we've still got this mentality in our communities, reefer madness, call it what it is, where a lot of people view cannabis as, the devil's weed still. A lot of people are kind of okay about CBD as long as there's none of that dreadful THC in there, and of course that's a fallacy. It's very easy to manage THC, and in fact just about every single person I see who comes to me for knowledge and information and access, they all require THC. Rebecca alluded to that. CBD works better with a bit of THC. So yeah, and it's not a one size fits all.
I think it will reduce the stigma. There's a survey that was done in the last couple of months with 30,000 Americans in 9 different states, and overwhelmingly people said that the legislation had been positive, and I think that we'll see something similar, and the stigma will reduce very quickly.
And
I agree with that. Yeah, so I'm a dual citizen and I've lived here for 14 years. So it's really funny when I go back to the States, I'm kind of like a tourist, almost observing what's happening with cannabis over there and changing so quickly. And my family's in California. And so I've observed what's happened there, from first having medicinal and then having a recreational referendum pass. And I think the referendum, even in California, which had a huge cannabis culture already, has really decreased the stigma around cannabis use. Yeah, it's super mainstream. It's everywhere. It's big business. It's advertised. But when I talk to people like I don't know, my parents' generation and people in their 70s, it's like way more common now that they're talking about, I don't know, cannabis cream for their aches and pains and all those things that previously under the medicinal would have still seemed a little out there. And it's just all filtering into the culture a bit more. And culture change takes time, but I think once something is legal, people kind of calm down a little bit. So there's hope.
I think that was a really nice question to end on, actually. I noticed that it's nearly 12 o'clock. I'm very mindful that people have put aside an hour of their time to join this webinar. I think it's been very fascinating for me. It's amazing the different perspectives you can get on things. So the bill was put together with harm reduction in mind, especially for those people who use heavily or use young, with sort of drug substance use issues in mind, I guess. And so looking at it from a patient perspective, it's a very different model that you'd end up with. So it's really great to have all these thoughts to feed into submissions that will hopefully be called to do if after everyone votes yes and we get yes in the referendum. So I wanted to just sort of say at the end that if you've been inspired by this talk, if you want to get more involved in advocating for a yes vote, there's many things you can do. I'd really encourage you to have a look at Health Not Handcuffs, which is a coalition of organisations advocating for a yes vote and other drug reform issues. And there's many ways you can help, particularly by having conversations with people, by writing letters to the editor, by doing lots of social media sharing and things like that. Don't let this referendum pass you by without trying to get that yes vote, because it might be another generation before we can get on to changing things. Otherwise, I'm cautiously optimistic we'll win, but I think it's by no means a done deal. So we do all have to pitch in and do some work around that. Also remember, there's lots of more information you can look up on our website, Health Not Handcuffs website, and on all those social media streams, also